Joining us now for a deeper analysis is Jonathan Lash, president of the World Resources Institute, a regular guest here on Clean Skies News. Jonathan, welcome home. And you return with something of a smile, right? What grade would you give this in terms of your expectations going in and the results achieved?
Well, I'd give it a B+, actually. First of all, you have to think of this compared to where we were coming out of Bali 2 years ago. Coming out of Bali, the assumption was that developing countries weren't going to do anything they weren't paid for, and they weren't going to commit, and they weren't going to be verified. And the U.S. went into these negotiations saying we have to change that paradigm because China, India, Brazil, Mexico, South Africa are major sources of emissions. That all changed at this meeting. You have commitments from all of the major sources of emissions to reduce those emissions, to register what they're doing, to report their progress, and to have that verified by a consistent UN process. It's a huge change.
Do you agree that this really is President Obama's treaty? His personal relationship with President Lula da Silva of Brazil certainly played a part. He had met with Prime Minister Singh of India in recent weeks, and Premier Wen they have a little bit of a deeper relationship. Was it really a cult of personality and his driving force to pull this together?
I don't think it was personality. I think it was leadership.
But it's to this individual, correct?
He and a few other leaders made it happen. When the president arrived, I certainly had a feeling in the pit of my stomach they weren't going to be able to get it done. The negotiations had just gone sour. And he turned that around through personal diplomacy and through, history called, and there was a group of leaders who answered.
What about the U.S.-Chinese relationship, which is so pivotal? We knew that going in. We've been analyzing the dynamics here for weeks upon weeks. Through the early negotiations, and at least what we received publicly from the Chinese and the U.S. Negotiating teams, they were stark contrasts in terms of what they wanted and were very firm they weren't going to yield, yet somehow there was the thawing process there.
I think that was the key breakthrough. The willingness of the president to negotiate directly with the Chinese, to understand the issues that they had on principle about their sovereignty, but at the same time to absolutely demand that there be some form of openness and verification. And in the end, the Chinese responded. This was a classic bargaining process, and it wasn't till the absolute last moment, but they did respond.
I want to read your reaction, which was issued by WRI immediately after this agreement was announced by the president. And I'll quote now, "Rather than let their survival be held hostage by a handful of obstructionists, they concluded an agreement with significant emissions cuts and financial pledges." We've talked about the second half. Yes. I want to focus on the first half, Jonathan. The handful of obstructionists. Who are they, and in your mind, will they play a role going forward?
This was just a very tough moment on that last night. Nations like Sudan, that was the leader of the G77, a nation that accused the wealthy nations of genocide because of this agreement, although we think of genocide as applied to them. The Chavistas, the Saudis who resisted agreement, all were trying to obstruct this process. What was interesting that happened was that in the end, so many nations wanted to find a way to move forward that they basically invented a new process to get around that obstruction.
Is that something that will have to change going forward? There have been many complaints about the obstructionist structure, if that's the right point, of the UN, and the fact that during the first week, a tiny, tiny nation like Tuvalu could stop negotiations entirely. The process would grind to a halt. Does it need to be revised in your mind?
I think they began the process of revising it. I think that this device of having the Conference of Parties take note of the Copenhagen Declaration, which was the declaration agreed to by 180 plus nations, is a new process. And if over the next 6 to 8 months we can make it work, it enables nations to move forward, notwithstanding the fact that there are a few small nations who are resisting. I was just going to add, since you made the reference to Tuvalu, a crucial turning point that last night was a speech by the president of the Maldives, another nation that's going to go under as the seas rise. Just a passionate statement of, we have a way to move forward. let's stop bickering, let's seize this opportunity, let's look history in the eye and do this. And he got thunderous applause.
Was it a swing and a miss, Jonathan, on red? That seemed to be the one thing that everyone agreed upon going in, and yet there's nothing binding coming out of Copenhagen.
I think red is going to move forward because there is a common interest in the forested nations to find a way to do it, and in the industrialized nations to find a way to reduce those emissions, and in the U.S. to use those reductions as offsets. They essentially solved all the tough negotiating problems. Now they just need to get the agreement in place and functioning.
Final question then, Jonathan. What lies ahead for Mexico City? Is it indeed Copenhagen Part 2? Or is that a series of expectations that are too high, judging by the realities of this negotiating process?
I'm not looking that far yet. The declaration says that countries are going to register their commitments by January 31st. That's a key date, and we have to see whether they really step forward to implement this. In Mexico City, they can take advantage of the successful negotiation on technology and adaptation and put those decisions in place.
Jonathan Lash is president of the World Resources Institute. As I said, a regular guest with us here on Clean Skies News. Thank you for braving a snowy morning here in the nation's capital, Jonathan.
It's beautiful this morning, though.
Walking downtown's not so bad. Thank you again, Jonathan. Jonathan will be joining us along with Chris Flavin on Clean Skies Sunday this weekend here in Washington, D.C. For a look at what Copenhagen was and what it could lead to. That's at Clean Skies Sunday, 9:30 a.m. Eastern here in Washington, D.C.